The rain poured relentlessly as Captain James Carter stepped onto the tarmac, his uniform soaked despite the military-issued raincoat draped over his broad shoulders. The weight in his chest was heavier than the duffel slung across his back. He wasn't just traveling, he was escorting his best friend home. Sergeant Daniel Reed had served alongside him in 3 deployments. They had fought, bled, and survived together, until an ambush in a war-torn desert had changed everything. James had made a promise, one whispered between explosions and chaos. If one of us goes down, the other gets him home. Now, that promise led him here, to a civilian airport where the world kept moving as if nothing had changed. People bustled around, dragging suitcases, sipping coffee, checking their phones. They had no idea that inside a metal coffin being loaded onto the plane was a man who had given his life for the country they took for granted. James adjusted his uniform and walked toward the check-in counter. His flight was booked by the military, the arrangements made with precision. But as he handed over his ID, he noticed the clerk's face shift. Tight lips, narrowed eyes, a flicker of annoyance. "I'm sorry, sir," she said in a tone that was anything but. "You'll need to check your uniformed escort status with the airline before boarding." James frowned. "I already did. The arrangements were cleared." She gave him a thin-lipped smile. "Regardless, there are policies in place." Policies. He'd escorted fallen brothers home before. There had never been an issue, but something about her demeanor told him this wasn't about policy. It was about control. "Let me speak to a manager," he said, his voice firm. "Sir, there's no need." "There is," he interrupted, leveling his gaze. She sighed, rolling her eyes before waving over a supervisor. The man who arrived barely glanced at James's uniform. "What's the problem?" the supervisor asked, clearly impatient. "I'm escorting a fallen soldier," James said, carefully reining in his anger, "and I need to be on that plane." The supervisor gave a tight smile. "Yes, but you're flying economy, and our policy states that military escorts must purchase a first-class ticket if they want to accompany remains. Otherwise, the airline will handle transport separately." James felt his pulse spike. "You want me to pay to escort my brother home? It's our policy." James clenched his jaw. It wasn't about money. It was about respect, about duty. And these people, these civilians who had never seen a battlefield, never felt the weight of a folded flag in their hands, wanted to make it difficult. The anger simmered in his chest. But before he could respond, another voice cut through the air. "What's the holdup?" James turned to see a man in a dark suit approaching. There was something commanding about him, an air of authority that made the employees straighten. The supervisor hesitated before answering. "This passenger is demanding to fly economy as a military escort," he explained. "But our policy states that—" "Forget the policy." The man's voice was cold, clipped. "He flies immediately." The supervisor blinked. "Sir, but—" "I'm the airline's regional director," the man snapped. "And I will not be the face of an airline that disrespects the men and women who fight for our country." James exhaled, his grip on his duffel loosening slightly. The regional director turned to him, offering his hand. "Captain Carter, I apologize for this." James shook it, his grip firm. "I just want to get him home." "And you will," the director assured him. "First class, no charge." James didn't care about first class. He cared about the coffin in the cargo hold. But at least, for once, someone understood. As he boarded, he didn't look back. His duty wasn't to the airline or their policies. His duty was to Daniel, and nothing would stop him from fulfilling it. James settled into his seat, the stiffness in his shoulders refusing to ease. The plane hummed around him, passengers boarding with their bags, chatting, laughing, living. He stared out the window where the rain had slowed to a drizzle, streaking the glass like silent tears. In the cargo hold below, Daniel was there, silent, still, wrapped in the flag they had both sworn to protect. A flight attendant approached, her expression softer than the staff at the counter. "Captain Carter?" she asked quietly. James turned. "Yeah? I just wanted to say I'm sorry for your loss and for what happened at check-in. That shouldn't have happened." He studied her, searching for any sign of the condescension he'd seen earlier. But there was none, just sincerity. "Thank you," he said simply. "If you need anything, just let me know," she added before moving on. James leaned back, exhaling slowly, his hands clenched in his lap. He didn't want gratitude. He didn't want sympathy. He wanted his best friend alive, sitting beside him, joking about how overpriced airport food was. But that wasn't reality. Reality was a folded flag and a grieving family waiting on the other side of this flight. As the final passengers boarded, an older man took the seat beside him, white-haired, with sharp eyes that had seen more years than James could guess. He gave James a nod. "Military?" the man asked. "Yes, sir." "Army?" "Marines." The man nodded again, a flicker of respect in his expression. "Thought so. Name's Robert. James Carter." Robert studied him for a moment before speaking again. "Escorting someone home?" James swallowed the lump in his throat. "Yes, sir." Robert's expression darkened slightly. "I figured. My son was brought home the same way." James turned to him fully. "Your son was military?" "Navy," Robert said. "Killed in action 12 years ago. Different war, same pain." He sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. "The way they treat our fallen sometimes. It's an inconvenience. Makes my blood boil." James nodded, the frustration from earlier still simmering under his skin. "They tried to stop me from flying with him." Robert's jaw tightened. "Damn shame." James took a slow breath, trying to let it go. The battle had been won. The regional director had made sure of that. But the fact that it had even been a fight in the first place, it burned. The plane taxied down the runway, engines roaring to life. James closed his eyes, gripping the armrest as they lifted off. Every second in the air was a second closer to home. As the plane settled at cruising altitude, Robert cleared his throat. What was his name? James opened his eyes. "Sergeant Daniel Reed." Robert nodded solemnly. "Tell me about him." James hesitated. Not because he didn't want to, but because he wasn't sure if he could. But as he looked at the older man beside him, he saw someone who understood. Someone who had lost, just like he had. And so, James spoke. He told Robert about the time Daniel had saved his life in Afghanistan, dragging him out of a firefight when James had taken a round to the leg. He spoke about the stupid inside jokes they shared, the way Daniel always managed to find the worst food on base, the way he had talked nonstop about going back home to propose to his girl. And when James got to the part about the ambush, the one that had taken Daniel and left James breathing, his voice cracked. Robert didn't say anything, didn't push. He simply nodded, his own eyes misty. "Sounds like a damn good man," he said finally. "He was," James whispered. For a while they sat in silence, the hum of the plane the only sound between them. Then, over the intercom, the captain's voice crackled through. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'd like to take a moment to acknowledge that we have a military escort on board. Captain James Carter is accompanying a fallen hero home. We thank him for his service and for ensuring his brother-in-arms receives the honor he deserves." The plane went quiet. Then, slowly, a ripple of motion. Passengers turning to look at James, nodding, some placing hands over their hearts. And then, a sound James hadn't expected. Applause. It started small, then grew, spreading through the cabin until the entire plane was clapping. James swallowed hard. his chest tightening. He wasn't the one who deserved the honor. Daniel did. But maybe, just maybe, this moment was for him, for all the Daniels who never made it home. James stared at his hands as the applause slowly faded, his throat tight with emotion. He had never wanted attention, never sought out recognition. This wasn't about him. It was about Daniel, the brother he had lost, the man who deserved every bit of honor this world could give him. Robert patted his shoulder, a firm but understanding gesture. "People need moments like this, son," he said quietly, "to remember what sacrifice looks like, to remind them that freedom ain't free." James nodded but said nothing. He wasn't sure he trusted himself to speak. The flight continued in relative silence after that, the occasional murmur of conversation or the clinking of glasses from the flight attendants passing drinks. James found himself staring at the seatback in front of him, his mind trapped in the past. The desert sun, the gunfire. The moment he realized Daniel wasn't getting up, he blinked hard, pushing the memory away. Not now. A few rows ahead, a mother struggled to calm her crying baby. Across the aisle, an older woman knitted quietly, her needles clicking against each other in rhythmic precision. Life went on. Even here, at 30,000 feet, life moved forward. It always did. The flight attendant returned, kneeling beside James's seat. "Captain Carter," she said softly. He looked at her. "I just wanted to let you know that when we land, the airline has arranged for a special deplaning procedure," she explained. "You'll be the first off, and the honor guard will be waiting." James nodded. "Thank you." She hesitated, then added, "The pilot also requested permission to have the passengers remain seated while you disembark." To show respect, James exhaled slowly. He hadn't expected that. "That's appreciated." She gave a small, warm smile. "It's the least we can do." As she walked away, James turned to Robert, who was watching him with an expression that was equal parts sorrow and pride. "It's good to see people still care," the older man said. James nodded, but said nothing. He had seen both sides of this country, the gratitude and the indifference. The way some people would shake a soldier's hand while others would barely glance at a folded flag. The intercom crackled again. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be beginning our descent shortly. Please ensure your seatbelts are fastened and tray tables are in their upright positions." James straightened, bracing himself. Not for the landing, but for what came next. Home, or what was left of it. The descent was smooth, but his stomach churned. Outside the window, the city lights stretched out like a blanket of gold, flickering beneath the night sky. Somewhere down there, Daniel's family was waiting. His fiancée, his parents, the people who would never hear his voice again. The plane touched down with a slight jolt, rolling down the runway before slowing to a stop. James barely noticed the usual flurry of movement as passengers reached for overhead bins, eager to be the first off. But this time, no one moved. The silence was heavier than any noise could have been. A flight attendant opened the door. "Captain Carter," she said, her voice softer than before. "Whenever you're ready." James stood, adjusting his uniform, his movements slow and deliberate. He grabbed his duffel, then turned to Robert. "Thank you," he said. Robert gave him a firm nod. "You take care, son. And when you see his family, you tell them he was remembered." "I will." James stepped into the aisle and walked toward the door, the weight of hundreds of eyes on him. Not a single passenger had moved. No shuffling bags, no ringing phones, just silence. And then, as he passed row after row, something incredible happened. One by one, passengers placed their hands over their hearts. Some whispered, "Thank you." Others simply nodded. By the time James reached the front of the plane, his chest was so tight he could barely breathe. He stepped onto the jet bridge, the cool night air hitting his face. And there, waiting just beyond the terminal windows, was the honor guard. A row of Marines stood at attention, a military chaplain, and beyond them, the flag-draped coffin being carefully unloaded from the cargo hold. James stood at attention, raising his hand in a salute as his best friend was carried home. A hero's farewell. A promise kept. James stood motionless as the honor guard moved with silent precision, lifting Daniel's flag-draped coffin onto the waiting transport. His salute remained steady, his fingers pressed firmly to his brow despite the tremor in his chest. This moment wasn't about him. It was about Daniel, about respect, about sacrifice. The airport bustled beyond the solemn scene, oblivious travelers hurrying past the windows, rolling suitcases, chattering on phones. But here, on the tarmac, time had slowed. The Marines carrying the coffin moved with practiced grace, their faces expressionless, their movements reverent. Each step was measured, deliberate. They weren't just transporting a fallen soldier, they were carrying a brother home. James finally lowered his salute as the casket was secured, his fingers curling into a tight fist by his side. His heart pounded, grief clawing at his ribs. A voice broke the silence. "Captain Carter." James turned, finding a middle-aged man in a dark suit standing behind him. His salt-and-pepper hair was neatly combed, his expression carefully controlled, but his eyes betrayed something deeper. "I'm Colonel Hastings," the man said, offering his hand. "Military liaison for the family." James shook it firmly. "They're here?" Hastings nodded. "Inside the terminal. The Reed family wanted to be here the moment he arrived." James inhaled sharply. Of course they did. He had dreaded this moment from the second he took on this duty, the moment he would have to look into the eyes of the people Daniel left behind. "Thank you, sir," he said. Hastings studied him. "You served together?" "Yes, sir. 3 deployments." The older man's face softened. "Then you were more than just his escort. You were his family." James swallowed hard, but nodded. Hastings exhaled. "Let's not keep them waiting." James followed the colonel into the terminal, his boots striking against the polished floor. The hum of airport life pressed in around them, passengers hurrying by, announcements droning overhead, the faint beeping of luggage carts reversing. But as they neared the designated waiting area, a hush settled over the space. A small group stood near the windows, their eyes locked on the tarmac. James spotted Daniel's father first, an older man with broad shoulders and weathered hands, gripping his wife's fingers so tightly their knuckles were white. Daniel's mother stood beside him, her face pale, her eyes red-rimmed but dry, as if she had no more tears left to give. And then there was her, Samantha, Daniel's fiancée, her hands clutched at the chain around her neck, the engagement ring Daniel had never gotten the chance to place on her finger hanging from it. Her blue eyes, once so full of life, were hollow now. James's feet felt like lead as he stepped forward. The room held its breath. Daniel's father was the first to move. He took a step forward, his jaw clenched, his gaze locking onto James with an intensity that sent a shiver down his spine. James braced himself for the anger, the pain, the questions. Why him? Why not you? But instead, the older man's face crumpled. And then, without hesitation, he pulled James into a tight embrace. James froze for half a second before he returned it, gripping the man as if he were the only thing keeping them both from falling apart. "Thank you," Daniel's father whispered, his voice raw, "for bringing my son home." James clenched his eyes shut. "I'm sorry," he choked out. "I tried." "We know," Daniel's mother interrupted gently. When James pulled back, he saw tears running silently down her face. "We know you did." Samantha hadn't moved. She stood there, staring at him, her fingers still clutching that ring. James stepped toward her. "Sam!" And then she did something he hadn't expected. She threw her arms around him and broke. The sobs she had been holding back tore through her, her entire body shaking against him. James held her as tightly as he could, feeling every ounce of her pain seep into him. "He was coming home," she whispered between ragged breaths. "He was supposed to come home." James shut his eyes. "I know." The rest of the world faded. The terminal, the people, the noise, it all disappeared. Right now, there was only grief and the unbearable weight of loss. Samantha trembled in James's arms, her sobs muffled against his chest. He held her steady, letting her break because he knew there was nothing else he could do. No words would bring Daniel back. No promises would erase the pain. All he could do was stand here and bear it with her. After a long moment, she pulled back, wiping at her swollen eyes. "I'm sorry," she whispered. James shook his head. "Don't be." Daniel's mother stepped forward then, her frail frame stiff with the kind of grief only a mother could know. "Did he suffer?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. James's chest tightened. He had dreaded this question most of all. "No," he lied. It was quick. Her lip trembled and she nodded. Maybe she knew he wasn't telling the full truth. Maybe she just needed to believe it. Either way, he wouldn't take that comfort from her. Daniel's father placed a hand on James's shoulder, his grip firm. "You brought him home. That means everything." James nodded, the lump in his throat making it impossible to speak. A throat cleared behind them. "Colonel Hastings." "The honor guard is ready to proceed to the funeral home," he said gently. Daniel's mother let out a shaky breath, gripping her husband's arm. Samantha swallowed hard, nodding, her fingers still curled around the engagement ring. James squared his shoulders. "I'll be with him until the very end." Samantha's eyes flickered with something unreadable, but she didn't question it. The small group moved as one toward the airport exit where two black SUVs waited outside, their hazard lights flashing against the darkened glass of the terminal doors. The hearse stood between them, the back doors open, waiting for Daniel's casket. Outside, a handful of bystanders had gathered, watching the silent procession unfold. Some held their hands over their hearts. Others simply stood with solemn expressions, as if unsure what else to do. The honor guard moved with quiet efficiency, lifting the flag-draped casket from the transport with the same care they would a sacred relic. James fell in step beside them, his presence as an escort not just protocol, but personal. As the casket was secured inside the hearse, the lead Marine stepped forward and turned to Daniel's parents. "Mr. and Mrs. Reed," he said with measured formality, "your son is home." Mrs. Reed let out a small, broken sob, and her husband wrapped an arm around her shoulders, his own face carved from stone. James stepped forward. "I'll ride with him," he said firmly. Colonel Hastings hesitated, then nodded. "Of course." Samantha looked like she wanted to say something, but the words never came. Instead, she just stared at James, her expression a storm of emotions, too complex to name. James turned without another word and climbed into the hearse. The driver gave him a brief nod of acknowledgement before shutting the door. And then the vehicle pulled away, leading the solemn convoy into the quiet streets. James exhaled slowly, his gaze locked on the flag-draped casket before him. "You were supposed to make it, man," he murmured. "You were supposed to come back and marry her." The only response was the soft hum of the tires against the road. James leaned back, closing his eyes for just a moment. The job wasn't done yet. Not until Daniel was laid to rest. The drive to the funeral home was silent except for the low hum of the engine and the occasional crackle of the police escort's radio. James sat rigidly in the back of the hearse, his eyes never leaving the flag-draped casket in front of him. His mind drifted. back to the last time he and Daniel had talked about home. "You think she'll say yes?" Daniel had asked, turning the small velvet box over in his fingers. "She'd be crazy not to," James had replied with a smirk. Daniel had grinned, shoving the box into his pocket. "When we get back, man, first thing I'm doing is asking her." But Daniel never got to ask. James clenched his fists, his nails digging into his palms. He had replayed that day in his head 1,000 times, searching for something, anything, he could have done differently. Maybe if he had been a second faster, fired one more shot, taken a different route. But war didn't work like that. Regret didn't change reality. The hearse slowed as they approached the funeral home. A small group of military personnel and close family members were already gathered outside, waiting in the dim glow of the streetlights. James exhaled, straightening his uniform. This part would be even harder. The doors opened, and the funeral home staff stepped forward. James climbed out, barely noticing the cold air biting at his skin. The honor guard was already in position, waiting to transfer Daniel's casket inside. James stood at attention as the Marines lifted the casket once more, moving with silent precision. The folded flag atop it barely shifted, perfectly placed, a symbol of a debt that could never truly be repaid. Samantha stood just a few feet away, her arms wrapped around herself. Her face was unreadable, but her eyes were locked on Daniel, on what was left of the life they were supposed to have together. James walked up beside her, unsure if he should say anything. What could he say? After a moment, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "Did he suffer?" The same question Daniel's mother had asked. James hesitated. The truth sat like a stone in his throat. "I was with him," he said carefully. "He wasn't alone." Samantha blinked rapidly, her breath hitching. James wasn't sure if she saw through his omission, but she didn't press. The honor guard finished their solemn duty, and the funeral director approached the family, speaking in hushed tones about arrangements for the next day's service. James took a step back, giving them space. His job was almost done. He had brought Daniel home. And yet, the weight in his chest hadn't lessened. Because the truth was, James hadn't just lost a brother in arms. He had lost a piece of himself in that desert, left behind in the sand alongside Daniel's last breath. And he wasn't sure he'd ever get it back. James stood outside the funeral home, the night air cool against his face. The ceremony was set for tomorrow, and soon Daniel would be laid to rest with full honors. But even as the official duties neared their end, the weight on James's chest refused to lift. He watched as Daniel's parents and Samantha spoke quietly with the funeral director, their grief wrapping around them like a thick fog. They were planning the last goodbye, arranging every painful detail. James knew that once the casket was lowered into the ground, people would tell them to move on, to heal. But grief didn't work like that. It lingered, settled deep inside a person, changing them forever. He took a slow breath, forcing the thoughts away. His job wasn't to dwell, it was to see this through. A hand touched his arm gently. "James." Samantha's voice was soft, but there was something in it that made him turn immediately. Her eyes, still swollen from crying, searched his face. "Can we talk?" He nodded. "Of course." She glanced toward the parking lot. I need some air." James followed her as they stepped away from the funeral home, walking toward the quiet lot. The distant hum of cars passing by on the highway filled the silence between them. After a long moment, she spoke. "I don't know how to do this." James looked at her. "No one does." She let out a shaky breath. "It's like I can still hear his voice. I keep thinking my phone will ring, and it'll be him telling me he's coming home." She swallowed hard, but he was coming home. And then he wasn't. James closed his eyes briefly. He knew that pain too well. He had lived it before. Samantha turned to him suddenly. "Why you?" His breath hitched. "What? Why did you make it back, and he didn't?" Her voice cracked, and she immediately shook her head. "I'm sorry. I don't mean that the way it sounds. I just—" She covered her face with her hands for a second before looking at him again. "I don't understand." James felt like the ground beneath him had vanished. "I don't understand either," he admitted. It was the truth. Every night since that day he had asked himself the same thing. Why Daniel? Why not me? Samantha let out a slow breath. "He loved you, you know." James nodded. "I know. You were his brother, more than just in uniform." James felt his throat tighten. "Yeah." She hesitated, then took a step closer. "James, what really happened that day?" His jaw clenched. He had told people the official version, the clean version. But Samantha deserved more than that. He turned away, running a hand down his face before finally answering. "It was supposed to be a routine patrol," he began, his voice hollow. "We'd done it a dozen times before. But that day, something was off. The roads were too quiet. No civilians, no movement." Samantha nodded slightly, her arms wrapping around herself as if bracing for what was next. "We were halfway through the route when the first shot rang out," James continued. "Then the explosion hit. It flipped the lead Humvee. Everything turned to chaos." He exhaled, feeling the weight of that moment pressing against his ribs. "Daniel was covering our flank when they came at us from both sides," he said, his voice tightening. He saved my life. Took out the guy who had me in his sights." James swallowed hard. I was hit, but I could still fight. He was reloading when... His voice faltered. Samantha flinched as if she already knew. James clenched his fists. He didn't see the sniper. The silence between them stretched, heavy and suffocating. Samantha took a shaky breath. "He died, saving you." James's jaw tensed. "Yeah." Tears welled in her eyes again. "That sounds like him." James let out a hollow chuckle, though it held no humor. "Yeah." She stepped closer, her fingers grazing his arm. "James, that wasn't your fault." He didn't answer, because deep down, he didn't believe that. Samantha searched his face, then whispered, "I don't know how to move on from this." James met her gaze, his own eyes burning. "Me neither." And for the first time since Daniel had died, he realized maybe neither of them ever really would. The funeral was held the next morning under a gray sky, the kind that felt heavy, pressing down on everyone in attendance. The cemetery was filled with military personnel, family, friends, and even strangers who had come to pay their respects to a fallen hero. The honor guard stood in perfect formation, their movements sharp, precise, just as Daniel deserved. James sat in the front row beside Samantha and Daniel's parents. He hadn't slept much the night before. The weight of the past, the pain, the why him and not me. Questions had kept his mind restless. But today wasn't about him. It was about Daniel. The chaplain spoke about sacrifice, about duty, about a man who had given his all for his country. But James barely heard him. His eyes were locked on the casket, the flag that draped over it, the reality that his best friend was truly gone. When it was time for the final honors, James stood at attention as the 7-gun salute echoed through the cemetery. Each shot felt like a heartbeat, loud, final, absolute. Then came the folding of the flag. The precision of it, The care with which the soldiers moved made James's throat tighten. When they handed the flag to Daniel's mother, she clutched it to her chest as if it were her son himself. And then, the sound that broke every man and woman who served, the lone bugle call of taps, the haunting melody carried through the air, each note slicing through James's resolve. He clenched his jaw, standing rigid, not allowing himself to break. But Samantha did. She buried her face in her hands, silent sobs racking her body. James reached over and gripped her hand. She held on tightly, as if anchoring herself to the only person who understood the depth of her loss. As the final note faded, the chaplain offered one last prayer. Then it was done. Daniel was home. But James knew his own war wasn't over yet. After the ceremony, people drifted away, murmuring condolences, offering handshakes and hugs. But James stayed. He stood in front of the grave, staring at the fresh earth, the temporary marker that would soon be replaced with a headstone. Samantha stood beside him, silent. Finally, she whispered, "What do we do now?" James exhaled. "We live." She turned to him, searching his face. "How?" James looked down at the dirt, at the name of the man who had saved his life. "By making it mean something." They stood there for a long time before Samantha finally nodded. I want to do something for other families, for soldiers who don't make it back." James glanced at her, a flicker of something new in his chest. Purpose. "You won't do it alone," he said. Samantha gave him a sad smile. "Neither will you." James reached into his pocket, pulling out something he had been holding on to since that day in the desert. A small, scuffed-up metal dog tag, Daniel's. He pressed it into Samantha's palm. "He wanted you to have it," James said. "He wanted to come home to you." Tears welled in her eyes, but this time she didn't break. She nodded, gripping the tag tightly. The wind rustled through the cemetery, carrying the distant echoes of taps, of a life lost but never forgotten. As James and Samantha walked away, they weren't just leaving a grave. They were carrying forward a promise to live, to honor, to never forget. Some heroes don't wear capes. They wear dog tags. If this story moved you, take a moment to honor our fallen soldiers. Drop an emoji in the comments to pay tribute. If you believe in respecting those who sacrifice for us, hit like and subscribe for more powerful stories like this. And remember, freedom isn't free. Always honor the ones who paid the price. Comment below, what does this story mean to you? Let's keep the memory of our heroes alive.